Hello and welcome to the Musical Instrument Investigator. Today we're on the website of Shares, the French auction portal, and we're going to have a look at another auction by Vichy auctions. We already saw one auction recently because they have 3 days of auctions back to back. So this is number 2. This one is happening on the 1st of June. The way that it goes with Vichy is that usually the first auction's kind of like the lower kind of value stuff, the middle one is kind of in the middle, and then the one at the end is like the better quality stuff. So here we've got the kind of the middle stuff. 436 lots, because we know that Vichy just like to cram in as much stuff as possible, so be aware if you hate French violins and French bows, and this probably isn't the auction for you because it will be crammed full of this stuff. 24% sorry is the buyer's premium here. As I usually say, but probably forgotten the last video to say, that obviously this auction is in France, so check all the terms and conditions if you're kind of shipping something outside of France, import, export, etc., and make sure that you're aware of how these auctions work. And without further ado, because this is going to be a long one because there's so many lots, let's just crack on and just see what kind of things we've got. So this should be slightly better than the last one. So let's crack on and invoke the Babel fish translation there. So here we have a violin by Pierre Mansuy, Miracle 1780-90 with a Gersan label. So not too bad a start there. I think in these ones they come with a certificate, which is the last picture, so we can skip those. A violin by Lebert Humbert, 1930 to 1935. Yeah, it comes with a certificate, so we can ignore that. Violin by JTL, fairly standard, but at least in a better condition. Another JTL. Similar kind of thing, just expect another JTL. It's just going to be a sea of these JTL violins, because they did make a lot of violins in Miracle. Violin from the Derazy workshop, Miracle 1850. Interesting and rare 3/4 violin by Joseph Lancôme, Miracle 1868 in fact. Quite nice looking for a 3/4. Violin probably by Jean-Baptiste Jaumier, made in Lyon around 1830-1840. Missing a fair bit of the table there. Otherwise fairly interesting looking violin. Violin by Lebert Humbert, Miracle 1930s. Violin by Nicolas Marchant, Miracle 1820-1830. The double purfling. Another JTL violin here. And another JTL. I think we're going to be saying JTL quite a lot in this auction, I would expect. Miracle violin, late 19th century from the Derazy workshop. If we get past the picture loading demon that always seems to haunt us. Another Lebert Humbert violin, Miracle 1930, another name that we will no doubt see several hundred times in this auction. Doesn't seem to want to show us the scroll. An interesting violin, 18th century French violin bearing the Chapuis label, some restorations. This is a bit more interesting. Shame about the condition of the top, but nevertheless 800 to 1,000 euros, a bit more interesting. 18th century violin from the school of Grand Gérard. Yeah, that's quite nice. Violin by JTL, Miracle 1931. Violin by Lebert Humbert, Miracle 1920s, 30s. Violin by Julien Laveste, Montlecun, 1928. Another violin by Julien Laveste, 1930s. Another JTL violin, Miracle, 1910s. Wait for it to appear. The scroll must be super high on the file size. German violin, second half of the 18th century, with a Steiner label. Miracle violin from the end of the 19th century with a Cousineau label there. Miracle violin from around 1920, finished and sold by Julien Laveste. Another JTL violin. And a German viola, small size, late 18th century. 388, yeah, that is pretty small. Interesting scroll and things, so not bad, definitely curious. Violin bow by Francois Lot, 1930s. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazat, around 1870. Violin bow by Franz Albert Hermann. Violin bow by JTL, just without the frog, it seems. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazat, around 1880. Violin bow by Pierre Malines, around 1925. Viola bow by Roger Francois Lot, around 1970. Violin bow by Kunihuri Ushar. Violin bow by Charles Alfred Bazat. Violin bow by Joseph Morazon, pair. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lot. Violin bow by Francois Javier Bazin, around 1850. Violin bow by Marcel Charles Lapierre. Violin from the Vigneron school. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by Kunihuri. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazat, around 1890. Cello bow by Charles Nicolas Bazat, around 1900. Violin by Ushar Pair. Violin bow by Karl Adolf Heuer. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morazon Pair. And another one by Louis Morazon Pair. And on to the next page. A violin bow by Justin Parson. And a violin bow by Émile Francois Huchard. Hey, a late 19th century violin with a bouquet label. Looks interesting enough. Late 18th century violin. Body, no head there. Violin from Cousineau, made in Mirecourt, around 1930. Violin made by Durand in Rouen in 1895. Looks fairly plain. Violin by Albert Deblay, Miracle 1925. It's quite a nice back on that one. Violin by Augustin Chapuis, made in Miracle 1770-1775. Once again, fairly simple looking instrument. Quinton by Augustin Chapuis, made in Paris 1750-1760. It's had some repairs, but that's quite. I do quite like quintons. An 18th century French violin with the Carcassy label. Violin probably made in the workshop of Léon Mougenot. Another Julien Levesque violin here. Quite a nice back on that. Miracle violin, 20th century. Violin by JTL. Another Miracle violin. Another JTL violin. Violin by Lebert Humbert. Violin by JTL. Violin made by Leonidas Negini, or in the workshop in Paris. Interesting, slightly different, a bit more Guarneri-esque. Violin made in the Colin workshop. Violin by JTL. Mansui violin, made in Miracle around 1820. Miracle violin there, late 19th century, with the Klotz label. An English school violin, probably made by Charles and Samuel Thompson in London, 1760. Many breaks and restorations. Interesting, the painted purfling on that. Violin by Albert de Blay, Miracle, 1960. Miracle violin from the end of the 19th century, Breton model. Violin by Lebert Humbert. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lotte. A Lebert violin bow, 1955-ish. Viola bow by Auguste Rau, 1940. Violin bow by JTL. Another JTL bow there. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Eugene Cugnot. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morizon. Violin bow by Eugene Cugnot-Houry. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Justin Poisson. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazar. Violin bow by Horst Schicker, 1980. And violin bow by Francois Lotte. Double bass bow by Joseph Thomasin. Violin bow by JTL. Double bass bow by Joseph Thomasin. Cello Bow by H.R. Frechner. Violin Bow by Marcel Charles Lapierre. Violin Bow by Morison Frère. Violin Bow by Jean-Joseph Martin. To the next page. Violin Bow by Charles Louis Bazin. And a Violin Bow by Paul Weidhaus. Violin Bow by Eugene Cugnot. Violin Bow by Francois Lotte. German violin from the beginning of the 20th century with a Martus label. Violin by JGL. 18th century violin from the French school with a Steiner label. Some worm damage there. It definitely needs a bit of TLC, but it definitely has charm. Interesting head, not quite to my taste, but someone will like it, I'm sure. Violin from the German school, early 20th century. French violin, 18th century. Definitely needs a bit of work there. Violin by Etienne Drouin, Mirecourt, 1840-1850s. It's quite nice. 19th century violin. Another violin by JTL. Another violin by JTL. And why not? Let's have another violin by JTL. Violin by Lebert Humbert. Violin by Lebert Humbert. 19th century Mirecourt violin made in the style of Charot. Interesting scroll. 20th century Mirecourt violin. Violin made in the workshop of Georges Apparout in Mirecourt, 1937. Violin by JTL. 19th century Mirecourt violin from the Charot school. Interesting. Violin by Léon Mougenot. '20th century Mirecourt violin. Another French violin from the end of the 18th century. Definitely in need of some work there. Violin in the Lebert Humbert workshop. Violin by Léon Mougenot. A nice violin by Lebert Humbert. Well, they haven't said that about any of the other ones so far. 20th century German violin. Violin of the Charles Jean-Baptiste Colin Mazin, grandson, made in Mirecourt, 1945. Interesting. Violin bow by Antoine Legarde. Violin bow by L. Morison. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Violin bow by André Auguste Morison. Cello bow by JTL. Violin bow stick by Emile Francois Houchard. Violin bow by GATL. Violin bow by GATL. Viola bow by L. Morazon. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morazon. Violin bow by L. Morazon. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by Eugene Cugnot. Violin bow by Charles Joseph Theodore Guinot. Cello bow by Marc Lebert. Cello bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Max Leicht. Onwards again. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. 3/4 violin bow by Louis Thomasin. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lotte. Violin bow from the Houchard School. Violin bow by JTL. Violin bow stick from the Peugeot School. Another JTL violin. Violin by Grandjean Père, Miracle, 1820-1830. German violin, second part of the 18th century with a Klotz label. Violin by Augustin Chapuis, 1770-1775. Needs some attention. Still like him, still got charm. 19th century violin with a Guarnerius label. Another violin by Augustin Chapuis, made in Miracle, 1775-1780. So, oh, that's it, just in bits, ready to assemble. It's like a fancy 18th century build your own violin kit, so why not? Looks pretty cool. Another violin by Augustin Chapuis, Miracle, around 1775-1780. That's quite a nice one. I mean, I think the Chapuis really churned them out quite a lot, so there are quite a few of them about. Viola of a small size, 19th century, Mortissier label, 384. That is very small, but for a viola, but interesting nevertheless. Miracle violin, end of the 19th century with a Joseph Hill label. Violin by John Priestnell, Rochdale, 1888. Nice back on that actually, and they've got a few more images on this one for some reason. Violin made in the JTL workshop. Actually quite nice looking, that one. Surprising. 20th century violin. '20th century Miracle violin. An 18th century violin. '20th century violin with a Francesco Andina label. Violin by Colin Mazar, 1933. These are very popular at the moment. Violin by Prosper Cabasa, Miracle, 1830s. German violin made around 1800. Interesting narrow form. Double bass, late 19th century, with a label left side, L.J. Moncozet. Interesting looking thing. 20th century viola with a Tassoni label. We've got another one where there's a few more pictures for some reason. Someone must have asked them. 19th century violin. Another GATL. So I skipped over that one a bit quick, eager to move on. Another violin by Augustin Chapuis. Actually, the most Chapuis violins I think I've seen. We usually do see a few, but it really is quite a lot. Tabiesco violin there, 1856. Nice back, slightly odd shape to be fair, but something slightly different to the norm in any case. Now a violin by Augustin Clodeau, Mirko, 1840. On to some more bows. Violin bow by L. Morizon. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. Violin bow from the workshop of Victor Fatigue. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow from the Pajot School. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. And violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Violin bow by GATL. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Cello bow by GATL. Violin bow by GATL. Violin bow stick and button by L. Morizon. Violin bow by Eugene Cugnot. Double bass bow here by Albert Fleury. Viola bow by Roger Francois Lotte. And let's move on. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Émile François Huchard. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Viola bow in the style of Pierre Cugnot from 1880. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Violin bow by Francois Jude Gouliard. Interesting shape. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Cello. A 3/4 cello from the Eastern countries, retouched varnish. Yes, it does look a little bit dodgy. 20th century French violin made around 1930. Violin by Jean-Baptiste Chapot. Another one is more pictures. 20th century cello. German school violin made circa 1820. 20th century musical violin. Violin by Robert Humbert. Violin by Jean Strieberg. Miracle. A 7/8 Miracle violin with a Guarnerius label. Violin by Julien Levesque. Guadagnini model. Violin by Didier Nicolas Ain. Miracle, we saw a few of these in the other auction. Modern cello with a Maginot label. Violin by JTL, made in Miracle 1932. '19th century Miracle violin with a Chapuis label. Violin probably by Victor Clermont. A violin by JTL. Violin by Thomas Anderson, made in Edinburgh 1888. They seem to like 1888 for the English stuff, I've noticed for some reason. French violin probably by Francois Gand, Toulouse, kind of late 18th century. Quite like that. A cello by Louis Fussell, made in Bedford in 1994, not 1888 on this one. Looks slightly interesting, you could put it. Violin by René Simon, 1903. And a violin by Robert Humbert. Another violin by Robert Humbert. When the pictures load, he doesn't like the picture that time. Well, we've gone around the other way, but we got there eventually. German violin, 20th century. Another JTL violin here. Violin of Charles Jean-Baptiste Colin Mazat. Few more bows. Violin bow stick and butter by Louis Bazar. Violin bow by Marcel Charles Lapierre. Cello bow by Marcel Charles Lapierre. Violin bow from the Pecat School. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by Georges-Émile Bargenet. Violin bow by L. Morzon Frère. Violin bow by GATL, definitely a lot of those. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazar. So if you want a French instrument or bow, you really want to look at the Vichy auctions. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazar. And a violin bow by Pierre Chignot. Viola bow stick by Charles Louis Bazar. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Morzon Frère. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lotte. And we're on to page 6 of 10 now. Violin bow by GATL. Violin bow by GATL. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Charles Nicholas Bazin. Viola bow by El Morazot. Violin bow by Charles Alfred Bazin. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. Violin bow by GATL. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lotte. And a violin bow by Charles Alfred Bazin. Back to some more instruments. French violin, 20th century. 18th century violin there, original neck. Oh, 19th century violin with a Matthew Hardy label. Interesting looking violin. I think it almost didn't have a button, did it? No, it just doesn't have a excessively worn heel. You can say that again. There is almost is no heel left on that violin, so that's pretty bizarre. Schuster violin, Mark Nikerkin, 1913. A violin by Alphonse Pélisser, Mouscron, 1910. Another violin by GATL. Violin in the workshop of Georges Apparoute. Late 19th century violin with the Heart and Son label. And carrying on. Mirecourt violin, School of Grandjean. A cello, Mirecourt, 20th century. Violin made in Mirecourt, second half of the 19th century. Violin by Charles Jean-Baptiste Colomazin. A French violin made around 1750. And a cello, Mirecourt, early 20th century. Modern cello with a Barbieri label. Violin by GATL. 18th century French violin with a Solomon label. Head has been replaced. Interesting scroll. Violin by Francois Salazar, Mirecourt, 1820. Violin by Nicolas Mathieu, Mirecourt, 1800, 1810. Not too bad. Violin by Lebert Humbert. Violin made in the Lebert workshop. Violin by a JTL. Half-size violin by Nicolas Viaume. Stentor type, I think. Violin by JTL. see. Oh, nearly getting there. Some more bows, a viola bow by El Morazon. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Violin bow by Morazon. And a violin bow by Louis Bazin. Violin bow by Francois Lotte, 1945. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morazon. Got there just about. It's slow going. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morazon. Violin bow stick of Francois Lupo II, made around 1820. Violin bow by Prosper Colas. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lotte. Cello bow by Marcel Charles Lapierre. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lotte. And a violin bow by Francois Lotte. A violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Violin bow by Charles Alfred Bazin. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morazon. And viola bow by, from the workshop of Frank de Guin. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morazon. Cello bow stick by André Granier. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. A violin bow by Francois Picat, made around 1860 in snakewood, mounted in nickel silver, with silver trim, 5,000 to 6,000 euros. There is the estimate. Violin bow stick made in the style of Jacob Curie, 1,800 to 2,000 euros there. Oh, we're into violas. Viola by Amadeo Baganton in Turin, 1995, 2,000 to 3,000 euros. Kind of interesting enough. Violin Miracle, around 1800. Violin Miracle, sold by Caressa and Francais. Losing my brain there for a second. Violin made by Lebert Humbert. Violin made in the workshop of Honoré Derazy. 19th century violin, probably Eastern Europe, with a Gobetti label. Miracle violin from the end of the 19th century. A violin of the Lippold brothers. Interesting, that kind of trim of ivory. That's quite curious. 1,500 to 2,000. There's people that do collect those. A violin by Louis Colonel. French violin from the end of the 18th century with a Legato label. '20th century cello, probably from Eastern Europe. And a violin by GATL. Violin by Claude Remy. A nice 3/4 German 18th century violin, probably made in Mittenwald. Violin by Lebert Humbert. Early 20th century violin. '20th century violin with a Vervagra Ember label. That's interesting. The 20th century German violin. Violin by Louis Colonel. Violin by Charles Jean-Baptiste Colin-Mazin. A 19th century violin with a Viome label. Violin made in the workshop of Emile Boulanger, I think, actually. Violin by Amédée Dodouin. Mirecourt violin from the 19th century. Violin by Charles Jean-Baptiste Colin-Mazin. Some bows. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Viola bow stick by Claude Auguste Thomasin. Violin bow by Sylvie Masson around 1995. Snakewood, Baroque style bow there. Cello bow by Roger Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morison Père. Violin bow stick by Charles Nicholas Bazin. Frog by Alfred. Let's see this one. I lost myself for a second. Violin bow by Charles Alfred Bazin. Violin bow by L. Morison Frère. And violin bow by GATL. Violin bow by Charles Nicholas Bazin. Violin bow by Émile Francois Houchard. Onwards to page 8. Finkel violin bow, made around 1960. Violin bow by Charles Nicholas Bazin. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morison. Violin bow by L. Morison. Violin bow by Cugna Huri or Houchard. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Interesting. Violin bow by Jacques Poulot around 1990. Open frog in ebony, veneer and white wood. Buttonless. Single system. Interesting. Yeah, that's a curious design. Yeah, kind of a that's interesting. Definitely not seen one like that before, so that's good to know. Violin bow by JGL. Another violin bow by JGL. A violin bow by Francois Lotte. Cello bow by Emile Francois Huchard. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morizot. Cello bow stick by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Modern cello with a Lebert Humber label. A violin by Lebert Humbert. Violin by Lebert Humbert, Mircourt, around 1915-1920. Violin by JGL. French violin from the Calson School, around 1880. So I haven't usually expect to see a few of these, and this is the first one, I think. Violin by Albert Maginot. German violin from the end of the 19th century. Three-quarter violin by Nicolas Violin. Mircourt violin, late 19th century. French violin, second part of the 19th century. A 20th century violin. French cello from the beginning of the 20th century. A nice violin by Joseph Philippe Mugel. A modern cello, probably by Louis Fussell, made in Bedford. Interesting. Yep. Violin, 20th century German. Three-quarter cello, probably from the 19th century German school. Here's a viola, an Italian copy bearing a Montanari label. Interesting. 2,000 to 2,500 is the estimate on that. Violin by Amédée Dodone. Violin by Victor Clermont, Mircourt, 1770-1775. Violin Mircourt, early 20th century. Nice violin from the workshop of Lebert Humbert, 1935. 20th century violin with a Stark label. A violin by Bernard Millet, 1958. 3,500 to 4,000. Interesting. Violin by Lebert Humbert. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by André Morizot. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morizot. Violin bow by Charles Alfred Bazin. Violin bow by André Vigneron. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by Hermann Richard Frechner. Violin bow by Alfred Lamy. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Violin bow by Émile François Houchard. To page number 9. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morizot. Violin bow by Charles Alfred Bazin. A small bronze subject, a violinist angel. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morizot. A violin bow by L. Morizot. A violin bow stick by Dominique Poisson. Violin bow by L. Morizot. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morizot. Violin bow by Joseph Arthur Vigneron. A cello bow stick by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Violin bow by Paul-Émile Miquel. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Violin bow by Eugène Cugnot. Violin bow by Émile François Houchard. Back to some instruments here. Viola by Amadeo Berganton, Turin, 1996. A cello made in the GATL workshop. 20th century French violin made under the direction of E. Laurent. Interesting 19th century French violin in Guarnerius copy. Violin probably from the German school around 1800. Violin by Joseph Aubry, Le Havre. Modern cello with an uproot label. Probably a German violin from the end of the 18th century. 18th century French violin. German violin from the early 19th century. German viola, end of the 19th century. Cello by GATL. Small viola there from Miracle. 378, that is really quite tiny. That's the smallest one in this auction. Another French violin, 1775-1780. Cello made by Lebert. 20th century German cello with a Badarello label. And a violin by Charles Jean-Baptiste Colin Mazar. Violin by Lebert Humbert. 19th century cello, a newer replaced head, apparently. A violin, probably the school of Medar, around 1680. So fairly early, the earliest violin in this auction so far. A 19th century violin, labelled Nicholas Ain, branded J.T. Derazy on the bottom. Violin bow by L. Morizon. Violin bow by François Jude Goliard. Violin bow by Émile François Huchard. And a violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. And a violin bow stick by Émile François Huchard. Violin bow, workshop of François Paquet. Violin bow from the workshop of Herman Richard Frechner. Violin bow by Marcel Lapierre. Cello bow by Louis Joseph Morizot. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Cello bow stick from the school of Nicolas Duchesne. Interesting, definitely needs some work. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morizot. And a violin bow by Louis Joseph Morizot. Let's go on to the next page. Oh, not too many things, and we're nearly done. Violin bow by Marcel Charles Lapierre. And a violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by Cugnot Houry. And lastly, a violin bow by Célestin Émile Clasquin. There you go, circa 1925. Well, there you have it. That's the entirety of the Vichy catalogue for the auction, which is happening on the 1st of June 2022. This is the kind of middle range stuff. Most of it all needs a bit of work. A sea of French stuff, but as expected, but actually a lot more 18th century French things than I imagined. So yeah, not too bad actually. Some interesting stuff for a good kind of auction. Well, I'll put a link in the description. Check it out and see what you think. And as always, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Ciao. Many thanks for tuning in to the Musical Instrument Investigator. I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please like, subscribe and turn on notifications, and watch out for the next video coming soon.